Okay.
Team, we can begin. There was an urgent matter, so I'll be prepared to launch us into the webinar.
Okay. Del, are you okay to? Hi, everyone. If you could just mute yourselves. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Great to have you here for this session, Managing Education Resources in Response to COVID-19 and the CRSSA Act. I am going to now hand it over to Jonathan Moore to introduce today's session.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us this morning. For those of you who have not had the pleasure of meeting, I'm Jonathan Moore. I serve as the Deputy Superintendent for Student Achievement here at the department. The superintendent was scheduled to join us, but she got pulled away on an urgent matter. And so she would want me certainly not only to thank you for all being here, but to also thank you for all that you do in service to our students and educators across the state and within your communities. If we could transition to the next slide. Since about a year ago, I know that the superintendent would highlight the initial call that she had with many of you, what would have been either the 15th or 16th of March, when we were first made aware that school buildings would be closing, and began conversations around how the department could support you as you galvanized your communities to transition to distance learning. And I think she would also say that as we look back over the year that has transpired, all of the wonderful and tremendous things that have happened, from the safe and equitable reopening of school buildings to the ways in which we all have pivoted to ensure high quality instructional materials, to the way in which we've partnered with professional development. And lest I forget, how we all galvanized around the Connecting Kids initiative to ensure that every student within the state who was learning at a distance had access to devices and connectivity. And so this visual just represents the hard work of the collective. Of course, our work is in service to you all and could not have been made possible without you all. And so she certainly would want to take this moment as a celebration. We're so thrilled that we get to partner with our colleagues at WestEd. They have worked very hard on designing and tailoring this experience that I believe will be very beneficial for all of us, to help us critically think about the funding sources that we have available to us, and also to think about how we may leverage them in the best interest of the communities we serve. And so I'm really thrilled about that. If we could go to the next slide. Before we begin, I like to take this somber moment in remembrance of Ben Hayes, who served as the Chief Accountability Officer in the Washoe County School District. If you all have not had the pleasure of meeting him, you certainly missed out on a tremendous man of great brilliance, who we all, I imagine, came to rely upon at some point in our service here around his expertise. And so before the moment of silence, we certainly send our thoughts to his family and, of course, the entire Washoe County School District community as they mourn his loss. And so with that, let us take a moment of silence. And so as we remember his indelible footprint, and to our colleagues from Washoe who are on the call, know that you have friends in all of us, and any way we can be of service to you all during this time, please don't hesitate to reach out. And with that said, I'd like to introduce our friends at WestEd. And so I will turn it over to them at this time.
Well, thank you, Jonathan. My name is Mary Peterson, and I am the co-director of the Region 15 Comprehensive Center at WestEd. Those of you who are familiar with WestEd know that there are multiple programs under the umbrella of WestEd, and the Region 15 Comprehensive Center is one of those programs. We are privileged to serve the states of Arizona, California, Nevada, and Utah. We are one of 19 federally funded regional comprehensive centers. The network has these 19 regional comprehensive centers plus one national center. And our mission is to provide support and capacity building technical assistance to state educational agencies, SEAs, but also to LEAs and schools. So we are privileged to serve you, and we hope that you find this webinar useful and beneficial. Next slide.
So Mary, we were just going to ask folks who's joining us from today a few quick polls to understand where they're coming from. So if you could please take a moment to finish the survey in front of you about your school and district using funds. And I know you probably don't need any introduction to the housekeeping of Zoom. You've probably spent too much time on that. But just know you can mute your phones at any time, and please use the chat throughout the presentation. We'll be going to breakouts and then you can unmute. Give you 20 more seconds for the poll. Thank you so much for doing that poll. Thank you. I'm just going to publish the results of the poll. If you could just end it. Our presenters, you can see that data. Thank you so much for doing that poll. Folks are allocating their funds, and we have folks representing different groups with us today. So Mary, back to you about today's agenda.
We have two presenters who will be introduced in just a minute. And the agenda today is to really help you understand the Coronavirus Response and Relief Act, or as we say, CRSSA. After Augustus Mays unpacks CRSSA, then there will be time for discussion, questions, and reflections. Following that, Jason Willis will talk about how LEAs might want to think about aligning the resources that they have to meet the needs that they have for reopening. And after that, again, we will have opportunity for discussion, questions, and reflections. So we hope that you will, we realize how busy you are, but we hope that you will stay with us the full 90 minutes, and in those breakout sessions that you will share with your colleagues in Nevada your thoughts and your best thinking from your district on these two topics. Our objectives here are on the screen. So we'll provide an overview and hope we will provide a deeper understanding of CRSSA. We will also talk about the emerging trends that are being used by LEAs as they plan for reopening and, more importantly, learning recovery. And then finally, as I mentioned before, we've built in time for you to talk with one another and share your best thinking for this next phase of recovery and reopening. Sorry. So here we have our two presenters today. Augustus Mays will be our first presenter, and Augustus is Director of Government Relations at WestEd. And then following him, we'll have Jason Willis. And Jason is an area director in on the subject of resource planning at WestEd. They both bring great expertise and knowledge of the topics that they'll talk about. So we hope that you will be thinking of the questions that you might want to ask them. They're great. They have great expertise in these areas. So with that, I will turn it over to Augustus.
Thank you, Mary. I appreciate the introduction, and Good morning to everyone. I'm going to share my screen real quick and bring up my slides. Can we see them, Julie?
Yes.
Okay, great. Again, good morning. Happy to be here with you today. As Mary said, I am Augustus Mays, Director of Government Relations at WestEd. In that role, I work very closely with our comprehensive center network within WestEd, specifically the Region 15, which serves the state of Nevada, and work very closely with Deputy Superintendent Moore and the rest of the NDE team. And it's a pleasure to also be able to connect with all of you, those of you who work at the district level, around this federal relief package and sort of helping you understand the intent behind the law, the flexibilities you have to support, as Mary said, school reopening and learning recovery efforts. And also, again, one of the great things about these types of convenings as well, it allows you to connect with your colleagues in a community of practice, to learn from one another and hear about what you all are doing around some of these policies. So, as Mary said, we're going to unpack CRSSA, the Coronavirus Response and Relief Act. As you all know, it was passed late in December. It's one of now 3 relief packages that are now out and available to states and districts across the country to mitigate the negative effects of COVID-19. And if, again, as Jonathan had said at the beginning of his remarks, go back a year when we were all just sort of hit flat-footed with the impact of COVID-19 and its spread across our various communities and the social mitigating policies that many of our states had to take. And the initial relief package that was passed, which was the CARES Act, provided substantial funding to help all of our school systems shift from going from face-to-face instruction to either a virtual or hybrid model, as well as provide resources around all the things that we needed, especially for our most at-risk populations, around food and housing insecurity, other social and emotional supports that our students and educators and families needed. And so it took almost 8-9 months for Congress to get its act together to pass the next relief package, which is CRSSA. And this package, when you compare it in size, and I'll show you in a second, almost 3 times more than what we saw in the CARES Act. So it's $82 billion. There's $54 billion that's targeted towards K-12 education. And to sort of drive home the point in terms of the significance of the package, this slide should give you sort of a sense of the unparalleled investment that we're seeing in K-12 education. So as I said, last spring, the CARES Act was passed. That was $13.2 billion, right? One of the largest investments that we have seen go towards public education. Now you have CRSSA that's available to your state education agency and is being distributed to districts as we speak. That's $54.3 billion. And then we just recently had a couple of weeks ago, Congress passed and President Biden signed the American Rescue Plan, which had $170 billion overall, but $132 billion went towards K-12 education, bringing the total federal funding in the past 12 months to over $200 billion, the single greatest one-time investment we've seen in public education, which I know for many of you district administrators, that's a lot of money to be responsible for. It could be overwhelming in terms of getting it out quickly because it's emergency funding. So you want to make sure you target it correctly, you get it out in terms of where your highest needs are within your school systems, and that it's being implemented effectively. And just also to give you a sense in terms of the timeline, though, but one thing we want to talk about with you today, and Jason will definitely get to this point in this presentation. It's smart. We all need to think about go slow to go fast, right? Yes, it's an unprecedented amount of funding, none like we've ever seen, in our nation's history when it comes to funding for education at the federal level. But as you see how the funding is sort of broken up, the CARES Act funding, it has to be obligated and drawn upon or spent down on towards programs and activities by fall of this year, so September 30, 2021. CRSSA has to be, obligated, spent down upon around September 30, 2022. And then the American Rescue Plan, that funding, this latest tranche, of funding will have to be spent by September 30, 2023. So I say all that to say, in your poll and the responses that I saw, many of you already have your spending plans together. You have a plan around how you're going to prioritize funding. And Congress's intent around this funding, when you take a look at the CARES Act funding now to CRSSA, again, the CARES Act was really supposed to be this immediate relief to help schools, districts be able to pivot to, like I said, from face-to-face to virtual or hybrid, and as well as provide the other supports that our communities needed to be able to deal and mitigate the negative effects of COVID-19. This latest tranche of funding, and also, CRSSA as well as the American Rescue Plan, those two tranches of funding and monies are supposed to be spent towards more of a longer term strategy. One, of course, the first priority is to safely reopen our school buildings. And so they're hoping that states, districts really hone in on, utilizing some of this funding, especially for this school year leading into the fall, to get your facilities up and running, to have them in shape so that you can fully reopen. Now, I know in Nevada, you all have been open for months, but still, there are things that you can use in terms of just ensuring, again, that in preparation for the fall, that your school buildings and facilities are safe. And the second thing that you also can use this funding for, and which I know a lot of district leaders in Nevada will be focusing on, is learning recovery. So using this funding around certain strategies like diagnostic assessments to see where our kids are as they come back to school face-to-face, or what they need to in terms of instructional supports and interventions to get them where they need to be, or other types of strategies like summer programming or high intensity tutoring. Those are sort of the longer term sort of investments that Congress intended for these funds to be used. And so as I showed you on this last slide, you essentially have 2 school years to use this funding in a sequenced way to ensure that you're meeting those 2 priorities. And so if you, again, as I already saw the majority of you already doing within your districts, you prioritize, you take the time, and you focus the funding on equity. And I think, if we all do that, I think once this funding is gone in 2 years, we will look back and know that we spent this funding and money wisely. So I'm going to go into the sort of construct of how this funding is set up. So the $82 billion under CRSSA is authorized and funded through the Education Stabilization Fund. That fund was first authorized under the CARES Act. So basically it's the same structure as the CARES Act with a few modifications. The funding will be distributed to states, and then states subgrant them out to districts. And so that's the same sort of setup. Also, there's funding for governors. There's a pot of funding that governors can use across the continuum of education from early ed to post-secondary, but they can focus that funding on K-12. And that's set up through the GEAR Fund, even though a portion of that funding is different from the CARES Act, and I'll get into that later, because that funding has to go to non-public schools, and governors and SCAs are responsible for that. But I'll go into that later on in my presentation. And then lastly, there are some new reporting requirements for states and districts in terms of how they're capturing and reporting how they're using funding to go towards learning recovery strategies and reporting on that. But the main thing I want to say about this funding overall in terms of how it's structured, it remains very flexible. So I think there is broad flexibilities in terms of how districts and schools can use this funding, which is in the spirit of what we saw in the CARES Act, and also what we see now in this latest package, which is the American Rescue Plan. So in the Education Stabilization Fund, you have $82 billion. And then that is, again, distributed to states and districts through the Elementary Secondary School Emergency Relief Fund, or ESSER, which I'm sure you are all familiar. So ESSER 2 is this latest edition of this particular fund. And so of that $82 billion, $54 billion is going to K-12. And then, so as I said, the distribution of funds goes to state education agencies, and that's distributed through the Title I formula. So it's based on state's Title I share. And so Nevada's, approximate allocation is about 477 million. And so once Nevada receives that particular allocation, which it has, then the SCA, Nevada Department of Education, then is required to allocate that funding, no less than 90% of it, to make subgrants to its LEAs, which also includes charter schools. And that's also based on the LEA's Title I share in 2019, 2020. And so I put in bold there for you the allocation that districts will have coming to them for Nevada, which is 429 million. So of that 477 million that the state of Nevada is receiving, 429 million will go to out to districts based on the Title I share. And then lastly, I think this is another pot of funding to pay attention to that could come to some of the districts that are on this call, is that also CRSSA, just like the CARES Act, allows the SCA to set aside 10% of its funding to meet statewide needs and priorities, especially for their hardest hit communities. And so that 10% set aside, 0.5% of that or 0.5% of that goes for administrative costs, and about 9.5% of that, the 47 million, can go towards, and again, maybe this is something that Deputy Superintendent Moore can answer, but they can do it either through a formula, they can do it through a grant competition, but this can be prioritized for those hardest hit communities. So that's an additional funding stream that districts can access. Around the allowable uses in ESSER 2, again, there were originally 12 uses authorized under the CARES Act, expanded to 15. As you see here, I provided you a list of some of those. So, any activity that's authorized under current law or education laws like ESCA, IDEA, CTE, Perkins, providing principals and other school leaders with resources necessary to address the need of individual schools, providing mental health and services and supports. So some of the similar uses, again, are authorized and allowable for LEAs to leverage these funds towards. The new sort of uses are the three that I highlighted. And it gets back to, I said, the two priority areas that Congress really has intended for this funding to focus on. And one is around, again, addressing learning loss. And so there are specific provisions in the law that sort of spells out certain things that districts may want to use this funding towards. Like I said, administering diagnostic assessments to understand where our kids are at, implementing evidence-based activities to meet the needs of students. So professional learning supports that you could provide. So there's various things that you could use in this funding towards. And so that's one key area or one new area that's under the law. And then of course, again, for Nevada's in a different place than some of the other states in terms of reopening, but they also wanted to focus on, making sure that districts knew that they can also use this funding towards school facility repairs, improvements towards sort of, being able to reduce the risk of transmission, as well as providing funding to do, testing of educators, as well as, possibly the need of students to ensure that we have a handle on the community spread. So those are the allowable uses, but again, the real focus is on sort of aligned to what Congress's intent was around this funding, which was addressing learning loss and also providing funding to districts and schools so they can safely reopen. I'm going to go quickly through the assurances. The assurances are the same primarily that was sort of authorized under the CARES Act. So under CRSSA, a state still has to must maintain support for elementary and secondary education, based on the proportion of what the state provides in terms of funding, and that level of funding has to be equal to the average of the past three fiscal school years, or the past three fiscal years, so 2017 through 2019. But again, a state could, due to certain hardships or circumstances, could request a waiver to bypass this requirement, but MOE is the same. You can use this funding to pay employees and contractors, so to maintain your staff. SEAs and LEAs, to the greatest extent practical, continue to pay their employees and contractors if they want to receive this funding. And then, the reporting requirement, again, like I said, around, within 6 months, they wanted the Department of Ed, the U.S. Department of Ed wants a detailed accounting of how SEAs and subgrantees are using ESSER funds, and specifically around how they're addressing learning loss. So that's a new sort of requirement in terms of really focusing in on what states, districts are doing around learning recovery. The GEAR fund, there's $4 billion there. It uses the same formula in the past, 60% on state population ages 5 to 24, 40% on the state's Title I share. These funds are the same as the CARES Act, very similar to what is in the ESSER II fund. The only difference is half of that pot has to go towards, or over half has to go towards non-public schools. And those allocations are going to be overseen by the governor in partnership with the SEA. And this funding is supposed to, again, target the most at-risk populations within, school systems. And so a lot of the states that we've been working with have definitely been working with their governor's offices to make sure that that it really is focused on in targeting those kids who are most at risk for educational issues, as well as those kids who are living under the poverty line. So in terms of equitable services, the student population that this particular funding is really targeting is really trying to target those children who are going to non-public schools, again, who need the most support in terms of additional aid. And so, again, that will be managed and overseen by the governor within the state of Nevada and the Nevada Department of Education. Another thing that Jason will probably get into as well, and I will talk about, is also thinking about just the other funding streams, right, that touch child serving agencies. And so, and also those funding streams that also districts can access to support the students within your buildings. And so, there is $10 billion going towards CCDBG, $250 million towards Head Start. So for those districts that have, preschool programs, may want to sort of take a look at the funding that's available, especially if you're connected to some of these particular funding streams in the past in terms of leveraging them to support your children who are 3 to 4 or 4 years old. As well as, there's funding for broadband funding, especially for many of our districts, possibly in rural areas, that want to leverage and make sure that, you still have access to broadband and develop the capacity to provide and serve all of your students across your district. While at the same time, all districts may, again, want to continue some form of hybrid, a hybrid model in terms of a learning modality and sort of delivering instruction, maybe using it for equity purposes, right? Being able to leverage that particular technology to gain access to highly effective educators in key content areas. Just, other opportunities that broadband funding could present. There's $3.2 billion there. And then in terms of issues around food insecurity or housing or food insecurity, the Child Nutrition Program, SNAP, is seeing significant funding in this particular package. So there's ways in which you can sort of braid the funding within the ESSER II fund and also additional education related funding that can support your services to your students and your school systems. And then lastly, the Coronavirus Relief Fund extension, the CRF funds, have been extended an additional year. And so if your state drew down on that funding to support K-12 education, there's additional funding there. So that's just another source of funding that the state of Nevada is probably considering, sort of adding to the pot of funding that's supporting K-12. And the last slide I have here is, in terms of considerations, or last two, is, based on your assessment of where you're at in your schools, your top priorities, you want to take a look at what some of your learning recovery strategies could be. Because again, a large portion of this funding should be targeted towards learning recovery. So there are a lot of things that our districts across the country are really looking at. Again, is like extended or instructional time is one key area. PD, which I saw a lot of you sort of target and say that you're going to, take a look at professional learning models that can help adapt instructional approaches, especially with the incoming needs and growing needs that some of your students need. So it could be a focus on that. And then of course, a lot of the trauma that a lot of our kids and communities have experienced during this period, there's going to be a need for an increase in school counselors, trauma-informed practices in terms of instructional supports to our educators. So those are areas where you can sort of use these funds. So lastly, I'll just say, we're going to go to breakout session. It looks like Julie's trying to get my attention. And so I think these questions here will be the questions that you'll be focusing on in your breakout. Again, how might you coordinate federal CRSSA funds with other available resources to support the needs of your most high need students? So like I showed you on that slide, you have the ESSER II fund, which is over 400 million coming to Nevada. But then there's also these additional resources where you might want to blend and braid funding to support your educational needs. Also, most importantly, have a conversation about how are you guys thinking about sequencing your investments to support current and also anticipated reopening activities. And then the last question, how can these resources be leveraged into supporting learning recovery and school reopening efforts? So how are you thinking long-term, even though it's a one-time infusion of funding, unprecedented, historical, it's still one time, and in 2 years it'll be gone. So how are you going to build capacity to sustain some of these efforts as you sort of leverage these dollars to support you in this way? So I'll stop here.
Thanks,
Julie?
Augustus. We have about 2 minutes for any questions that come up on the content that you just covered. I wonder if Jason wants to ask you one or two. I know Jonathan is answering some in the chat.
Oh, thank you, Jonathan.
Yeah, so just to jump in really quickly, both Jessica and Lauren had dropped in a set of questions. I think more of Lauren's questions are probably for our NDE colleagues to tackle, but one question that I wanted to put out to you, Augustus, was from Jessica Topman, and she had asked, we've seen some state legislative proposals that allocate ESSER II funds for certain purposes. Is this something that the legislature has the authority to do? I offered that the authority by the legislature to oversee and authorize those funds differs by state. However, because the federal law identifies the entity, the SEA or the governor, et cetera, the default authority is to those agencies to distribute those funds.
That is correct, but depending on the state, the legislature could authorize legislation that directs the SEA or the governor's office around the priorities they need to focus those funds are. So I think, that's state by state, and it's dependent upon what the legislature wants to do in those states. But like you said though, Jason, the SEA for the ESSER II fund is responsible for distributing and providing support and implementation of those resources around programming.
Well, thank you, Augustus. Thank you, Jason. We'll have now time to be in the breakouts. It's only for 10 minutes of quick reflection, and Augustus went over the questions. We also posted those in the chat for you to reflect on. We'll bring you back in 10 minutes. And if you can think of a takeaway or question, we'll invite you to share that when you return. Thank you so much. We're breaking you into breakouts. Augustus, over to you, folks, if you could use the chat.
Yeah, so as Julie said, if there's like maybe one takeaway or one critical question from your group's conversation, that would be helpful to sort of share in the chat right now. We can all sort of view what those are. So one from Summer Stevens is great takeaway was to find a way to have a shared database of ideas and narrative language that we could all use in our write-ups and applications, or for just ideas on how people are using the funds. And that would be, I mean, that's more on the NDE side, but yeah, it would be in terms of just being able to collaborate and share best practices around how you're utilizing the funds and creating and continuing this sort of community of practice that we've created in this webinar. I think that's a great idea. Any other takeaways anyone wants to share? If not, and then one other thing I just want to say, from Lauren, good takeaway, NDE is working on an Excel sheet that organizes costs into reporting categories. All right, thanks, Lauren. So I was also going to say, there were a ton of questions that I wasn't able to get to during my presentation. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to work with Jonathan Moore at NDE to create an FAQ document that addresses some of the questions, or all of the questions, excuse me, that were in the chat that I wasn't able to address or get to, and then send that back out very quickly for all of you to review. So I just want to make sure that I know that there are questions that were asked that I wasn't able to address, just given the time that we have. And so I just want you to know I will create a FAQ document and then turn that back out to the group, hopefully with the follow-up materials that will happen after this event. So I will stop talking now. I will turn it over to my distinguished colleague, Jason Willis. Take it away, Jason.
There we go. Thanks so much, Augustus. I really appreciate the kind of setup for this second part of the webinar. And you know, as you previewed for the attendees today, I'm going to talk a bit about how to think about now leveraging this, you know, second federal package that we're talking about today with CRSSA. As you all are very well aware, there is a third, even larger set of federal aid that is coming to school districts and other local social service agencies. And so I will mention that in brief, but focus most of my comments today on, you know, what we're learning from the CARES Act, what we're learning from this early rollout on CRSSA. And so to get into our discussion, I want to first start with, you know, the step back of like what got us here in the first place, which has really been around the virus. And in particular, as I'm sure that you've seen in the news, and you know, Nevada is in a different place than a lot of other school districts and states in the country, and that, you know, 16 out of 17 of your districts are in some version back to in-person learning. Still, the virus is shaping a lot of this debate about what it means to have students back to in-person learning and to get them back to some reality of a normal learning environment. Largely, predictions came true in the country around this like deadly winter surge. This graphic on the right-hand side offers, you know, a very clear example of this, where we saw a huge spike in associated hospitalization rates for most age groups in the United States, but in particular for those that were 65 and older. And this really, you know, as you might imagine, caused a lot of conversation about kind of returning to, you know, distance learning, or kind of pulling back on efforts to get students back into school. Now, the vaccine, which has greatly accelerated it over the course of the last 8 weeks in terms of its distribution, and the US population that has now gotten the vaccine, is helping with these conversations and this push to return to in-person instruction that creates some sense of safety and health around having individuals interacting that aren't necessarily, you know, from a family or a pod within their learning within their home environment. And in particular, what we see from the vaccine is that it really does what it is intended to do, that it keeps hospitalization and deaths substantially lower than if the vaccine wasn't present. This graphic on the right just shows an example of looking at a run of data across, you know, COVID, how the vaccine trials were impacting hospitalization and deaths, and then a comparison to a typical flu season. One other thing that we have to be aware of in thinking about the trend and how this virus has impacted you know, our life and our interactions with public institutions is that in some ways it has broken a lot of the trust with public institutions, particularly for our underserved Black, Latino, and Native American populations in a number of different ways. And it's important to kind of keep that in mind as we think about, you know, as you as local leaders are working with your school communities, with those students, with those parents, and with other stakeholders, to think about how to kind of create the confidence to continue to move back into stronger and more robust in-person instruction in light of what's been happening with the pandemic over the last 12 months. And I think a lot of that is kind of underlined by, what you can see on the right-hand side here, in that those underserved populations have substantially and disproportionately been impacted by the pandemic. This just shows associated hospitalization rates by race and ethnicity. And you can see in some cases 3, if not 4 times the number of hospitalizations for our minority populations in the United States as compared to white or Asian or Pacific Islander. And so one of the things as we think about this at WestEd, like, what does this mean? What could happen in the future is really having a readiness stance for public schools. We don't know what the longer term effect of the vaccine will be, if there will be another surge that we see, even in light of the fact that a vaccine is being widely distributed across the country. And so it puts us in a position where we think it's best for districts and for states to have a readiness stance, right? So we've learned this ability to kind of go into a distance learning environment, try to come out of it into in-person instruction. So, being ready to kind of move and transition across those 2 different types of learning environments, we think is really important to remain prepared for in the event that that there is another instance where there's a surge of the virus and it pushes schools back into primarily a distance learning environment. One of the other contextual pieces here is really to think about pressure on available resources. And largely what we've seen over the course of the last year is that it's been a bifurcated economic recovery. That is, that not only has there been recovery in some places, but not in others, but also the way that Americans are experiencing the recovery is substantially different. And we can see this kind of demonstrated in large part from thinking first about capital markets. So the graph on the right-hand side shows the 3 major stock market indices in the United States, and you can see quite literally experienced both a V and then an even bigger recovery towards the back half of the year. And I don't think there was really anybody that would have expected this to occur. But what this also means is that states and how they bring in revenue, tax revenue, are experiencing the recovery different. And it also means that Americans, depending on where you are on the wealth and income scale in the United States, are also experiencing this recovery very, very different. One thing we do know is that that the jobs recovery side of this has been massively disrupted. And what you can see here on the right-hand side is basically the unemployment rate in the United States. The gray bar on the left-hand side shows you what the recovery and the impact on unemployment rates look like through the Great Recession, kind of starting at about 5% at the beginning, kind of rising and peaking right around 10%. And then the green shaded bar over on the right-hand side of the graph is basically when the pandemic began. And we were right around, some of our historically low unemployment rates in the country at about 3%, that like very dramatically spiked to nearly 15%. But then as folks kind of came back to work within a limited basis through the pandemic, we saw a kind of a drop of that unemployment rate to somewhere around 7%. But it has held steady at around 7%. And these numbers in particular are focused on those that are working, basically on, month-to-month paychecks that really regard the vast majority of Americans in the country. And so the volatility associated with this part of the recovery is contrasted with what I was referring to in terms of recovery in the capital markets. The good news is that a lot of what this means writ large is that state budgets are better now than what we expected them to be. This is a circumstance that we have to continue to watch really carefully, especially with such large infusions of federal funds, watching things like inflation, watching things how economies are building within certain states through the recovery and how that's going to affect state budgets down the line. And we know that a lot of the debates around the state budgets have been punctuated by these like highly charged emotional debates over the return to in-person instruction, which always complicate and elongate the conversations that and policy debates around how to think about dollars themselves. Now, looking ahead to next year, we would show probably a shallow recovery, not as great, particularly from the capital markets. But probably continued incremental growth in jobs in the United States, particularly in the jobs market. But we think that there are some segments, and I'll talk a little bit about this later, that are specific to public education that we think are really important to keep an eye on over the course of the next 3, 6, and 9 months, particularly as school districts think about how best to leverage these federal resources. So as I said, that kind of decreased state education funding is not as bad as projected, due in large part to this bifurcated recovery. But one of the things that we know is that there are costs associated with basically operating inside of an environment that is trying to mitigate against the pandemic. One of those things really is associated with the CDC's estimate at $442 per pupil per year to basically reopen schools safely, that in-person instruction. That is roughly about a 4% increase in annual budgets on average across the country. The graphic on the right displays both that, but also we think some important reference points for us to keep in mind as we think about the costs associated with not only reopening schools safely for the pandemic, but also some of the emerging estimates to help address learning loss or to accelerate learning for students over the coming several years. And in particular, that looks roughly to be around $2,400 per kid is where some of those estimates are coming together. But there are some studies that are being stood up, including some work being done by WestEd, to really look more explicitly at how that cost varies by different environment. Now, on the other side of that, we look at what is available. And we just wanted to offer 2 reference points. These are national figures, and we certainly can produce those for Nevada. The first bar looks at the state funding per pupil, which obviously is your operating ongoing resources. Title I on average produces about $446 per pupil, depending on the environment that you're in, if you qualify for it. And that the first rescue aid package that came in through CARES was roughly equivalent to that, right? So this builds on what Augustus was saying in terms of thinking about magnitude. And for ESSER 1, the CARES Act, that equivalence basically grew by 3x when the CRSSA package was introduced, and that's the fourth bar you can see here on this graphic. Now, states will make different kinds of decisions. In some cases, they will prioritize public education to help cover some of those additional costs. And Augustus talked a bit about where some of those opportunities lie and the chance for NDE along with LEAs to think about those longer term, those immediate investments from CRSSA itself. So when we think about tracking one of the things that we should be also thinking about is how do we think about where the use of funds were spent from the CARES Act? And this has been something that nationally we've struggled with. There were some poor reporting requirements around CRSSA. Nationally, through November 30th, only about 1/3 of the funds had been expended under CARES. You can see on the right-hand side here, as of that data, Nevada is one of the lowest in terms of funds that have been expended, which could be for a variety of reasons. And we think it's important to use these data in context, and in particular, correcting the narrative about just because you might have low levels of spending, that you have a meaningful and planned message around how and what you are going to do with those resources in the future. And so I think it's important for Nevada to reflect and LEAs to reflect on, what is this meaningfulness? Now, of course, these data, this is the last federally reported data that is publicly made available, is now nearly 4 months old. And so a lot has probably changed over that period. But here again, being able to kind of correct for any of those misstatements or misinterpretations of data that is out there is kind of vitally important. One of the other things that we think is important to be paying attention to is kind of the people associated with the work of public education. And what we've seen, this graphic on the right shows the trend in local government education. So this represents the totality nationally of your teachers, of your classified staff, of your administrators. And what we can observe is even through the Great Recession, that gray bar on the left-hand side, local government education employment stayed pretty high, right around 8.1 million. It was kind of moving up and down. That uptick that you see in the middle of that gray bar is basically the introduction of the SFSF funds. And it did its job. It basically protected the staff that were in public education at the time to buoy them basically over and across. That downturn that you see right in the middle of 2009, that downtick is basically the evaporation of some of those federal funds. Now, I want to contrast that with what we're seeing on the right-hand side of this graph, again, here in basically about a year back, that we see this enormous jagged change in local government education employment. The vast majority of that substantial downtick is actually classified staff. Most teachers have actually kind of retained their work across the period of the pandemic, but it's something that we think is important to really be paying attention to, particularly as we enter a phase in which we're wanting to accelerate the learning of our students, and with ideas such as summer school, extended learning time during the regular school year, thinking about how you create those, the meeting the demand of bringing in additional personnel is going to be really important in that response. Now, part of the good news here is that we actually don't see much of a change in teacher retirements over the course of the next year. This is just a sample from 7 states across the country, looking at the projected retirements, both back 5 years, but also for the future. And it doesn't look like we're going to see a lot of those retirements. In fact, what we're seeing is that teachers are likely to kind of stay in place, at least for the foreseeable future, given what's been the environment that we've been operating in. So it kind of brings this question to the forefront. How is it that you're thinking about in your LEA's context the source of people that's going to drive that learning acceleration, particularly if you're applying learning environments that create class ratios that are substantially smaller than what you had pre-pandemic? I mean, just by the numbers, you have to change some of those variables, either bringing in additional personnel to work with those smaller cohorts or groups of students, and or creating a hybrid situation in which you're asynchronously learning for those students while other teachers are working with those smaller groups of students. So a couple of principles to guide these federal relief funds. Augustus mentioned the kind of magnitude of the use of these resources: 3 times that of CARES for CRSSA. It is nearly 6 times that of CARES for the American Rescue Package and the planned resources coming to public education. This graphic on the right is a look at one of your kind of sister agencies, the BIE. They tend to have a right around the national average in terms of their spend. So I wanted to offer this as an example of how funds available through both the CARES Act, through CRSSA, and the American Rescue Plan might be sequenced across the time in which they are available. And what you can see here, the gray bar is basically, operating spending right around the national average. The green portion is basically CARES funds, right? So you have to have those obligated and spent by the end of this year, December of 21. And then the kind of introduction of the CRSSA funds, which are going to go on for a couple of years. And then, as I was saying, an even bigger jump in terms of those available American Rescue Plan funds is the yellow section of this chart. And so I think it provides us with this visualization, this understanding of both the magnitude of the amounts of resources, one-time resources that are available, but also puts us in a position to say, as Augustus introduced, we should be thinking about a go slow to go fast type of strategy, that these are a lot of funds that are coming at a critical time for our public schools. And we should be thinking about them as not only to be able to address some of those urgent needs, but also how do we think about transforming public education's delivery of learning for students in a way that really kind of takes advantage of this opportunity. So one of the things that we wanted to, as I kind of transition to the end here, is to think about some of the challenges and opportunities that you all have in front of you as LEAs to work with NDE in this context. And we've come up with a set of both challenges and opportunities that we think are important for you all to consider. And we'll push you into some of your discussions here in just a moment. And in particular, one of the things that I wanted to point out is that the first one here is this kind of managing a constant shift or changing landscape amongst these federal revenues, and that creating that common planning time for both prioritizing, thinking about how you're using time, especially of education professionals, and how you're focusing on our most at-risk student populations is something that we would advance as really important. And this came up in some of the discussions already, but thinking about, you know, some of the common issues that you all are going to address are in sharing that language to be able to fill out some of those templates is an initial start to this opportunity that we would advance. We also have been recognizing that, you know, just to say it plainly, the education workforce is exhausted. I think all of you as LEA leaders are doing everything you possibly can to manage through this situation. Being a former CFO in a set of systems in California, I still talk to a lot of my friends and colleagues that are practitioners in the field, and they are just flat out exhausted. And so we have to think about how do we create better sustainability that doesn't burn out our high quality professionals that are working directly with students or are supporting those that are working directly with students. And one way to think about that is to think about leverages across sectors, right? So if this emergent need from the survey that came up this morning, where I noticed that the vast majority or the majority of respondents had said that, you know, a student's mental and behavioral health needs are pretty emergent and that you're planning for that. How do you think about reaching out to other partners in your community that can provide those services, either community-based organizations or other mental health plans or medical plans, to provide those student supports that bring some relief to the education workforce, so it doesn't necessarily feel that, you know, it's all on the education system to address, you know, these very big holistic needs of students. The other thing that we would put on the table is, you know, thinking about the fundamental lack of data and insight into both school reopening, but also how to leverage those resources to in-person instruction. And so how might an LEA use a portion of, you know, set aside funds that are being provided to them by the SEA and or an SEA using their administrative funds to kind of collect that data to inform effective school reopening efforts. And I've heard already on the call that there's an opportunity that NDE is building to kind of collect and report that information. So thinking carefully about that template and how data that's coming in from the LEAs can really inform both the kind of overall look at what's happening in the state of Nevada, but also thinking about how that can be used for continuous improvement and monitoring cycles down the line as these federal funds are rolled out and used across school districts. So I want to hit just getting a reminder from one of my colleagues on my time available. I've hit a number of these. The one place that I wanted to touch on was really around thinking on special education, and in particular, the MOE fiscal requirements of IDEA. And by and large, those requirements for IDEA, for MOE and FAPE all remain in play. And just thinking carefully about this very last one around compensatory services for that segment of your student population, that likely those questions will come up from parents, and how both the LEA, but also potentially in coordination with the Department of Ed, are thinking about how best to respond to those compensatory services that really does leverage the federal dollars that you all have at your behest. So I will wrap up there and just pause. There may be some questions that you all have, but I know that we also want to create some time for breakout. So I will turn it back over to you, Julie, and then we can head into breakouts.
Thank you, Jason. If you don't mind just putting the breakout questions on the slide. I don't see any questions right now. Augustus, did you see any come up?
No, I did not.
Well, thank you. I think then we'll give time back to the breakouts. We'll break out and be back in 10 minutes. We just posted the questions to consider with your colleagues into the chat, and we'll bring you back. Thank you.
Yeah, there you go,
Yeah.
Julie. I think
Great.
everybody
Over
is.
to you. Yeah, great. Thank you, Jason. Over to you.
Great. Well, welcome back, everybody. We're going to be wrapping up here in the next couple of minutes. Before we move to close with this webinar, just if you could post in chat one takeaway and or one question that you had from your breakout discussion in the chat, that would be great as we kind of move to close. So hopefully that presentation of information was helpful for you. So Richard posted in the chat, any discussion on waiving federal or state SPED MOE requirements given the pandemic's challenges? Great question, Richard. So far, there has been no discussion federally of waiving those MOE requirements, which is, I think, part of the reason that we raised that as a challenge, but also as an opportunity to support both the department and LEAs to think strategically about that MOE requirement, given the infusion of federal dollars and in some cases, for example, a bit in Nevada, a bit of a deceleration in state revenue. So Sarah also posted in chat, I heard, quote, paradox of choice from our districts. The question is, how can we support districts to hire, provide services to recover any learning loss experienced? Yeah, Sarah, and I think this might be getting to your point around, how do you use one-time funds to support people? And here's what I would say. So often the golden rule is don't hire people on one-time funds. However, given the magnitude of this amount of funds, like remember that kind of run chart that I was showing earlier on in the presentation, that creates a bit of a lead time, right? So you could think about like bringing on some portion of FTE judiciously that you could have on board for say 2 years or even 2.5 years, that at least kind of creates the ability for you to give them that notice around their temporary staffing. Another way is to think about how you elevate existing personnel, maybe out of the classroom or out of schools into the central office to help with coordinating those efforts and then bringing in temporary teachers or temporary staff behind them. But I think that I love the way, Sarah, that you lay that out in terms of the paradox of choice. And I think maybe is worthy of some additional discussion with LEAs about how to make those kinds of plans and to execute them in bringing in personnel, even if it's on one-time resources. And then the final one here, Dr. Stevens posted how to consider working with our community partners for summer school, summer enrichment opportunities, instead of bringing them into us. Yeah, I think like this is the moment. I mean, April is the month. If you're thinking about those expansive summer plans or even thinking longer term into next school year around extended learning, is where do you find those sources of personnel, qualified staff? A couple of things that we have noted that potentially are available is looking at your existing teacher prep pipelines, looking at college students in the humanities, social sciences, or other related disciplines that might be brought in to support students that could be trained over 2 to 3 weeks to work with students in those environments. One of the other examples that you might kind of look to in terms of the supply of that personnel is looking to those recently retired individuals that have come out of the system, be them teachers or classified staff that might be willing to kind of come back to work with those students, especially if they're familiar with the school environment or with the LEA environment. And in that way, you're going to see that surge of needed supply to kind of meet the demand that we have for accelerating learning. So thanks all for kind of dropping those in the chat. And Mary, I'll turn it over to you to close out for our webinar. Thanks.
Great. We do want you to provide feedback to us. And Julie, I'm wondering if we could go to the next slide where the survey is. Or Dell.
It's up there, Mary.
Oh, it's right there.
Yeah.
Thank you. So if you could please go to this survey in SurveyMonkey and fill out the survey. We do use your feedback. We use it to improve our future webinars. And also if you have suggestions for topics of future webinars, we take those into consideration as well. So please take a few minutes to complete the survey and submit it. And as you're doing that, I do want to give thanks to many people who made this possible. We thank the Department of Education in Nevada for inviting us to do this with you. And we also want to thank especially Jason and Augustus for bringing their expertise and knowledge to us today and spending the time, not only today, but in preparing for today. Some people who don't often get recognized are the people behind the scenes who make this all possible. So Julie Duffield is a magician when it comes to making these webinars possible, as is Delphine Kwan. And so every time you see something magically appear on the screen or you magically appear in a breakout room, that's thanks to the wizardry of Delphine and Julie Duffield. Finally, I want to thank you for taking the time. We know that you are very, very busy, and we appreciate that most of you stayed with us this entire 90-minute session. We will follow up with FAQs. We've recorded the chat session. We've recorded your questions. We will debrief with the department and get a response to you in the form of FAQs as soon as possible. We'll also provide to you recording and the slides from today's webinar. So with that, thank you all. It's good to see so many familiar faces, and I hope you have a great day. Thank you.